Hello. Today I'm going to talk about this project that we have been working on, where we looked at the latitudinal specificity of plant-frugivore interactions. The latitudinal diversity gradient is perhaps one of the most general patterns in ecology, and it describes the decrease in species richness towards the poles. In a similar manner, there is also an expectation that species interactions would be more specialized in the tropics than in the temperate regions. And the reason for that is that in temperate regions, abiotic conditions would be the main factors shaping up biotic communities, whereas in the tropics, species interactions would be the main factors shaping up biotic communities. However, when looking at latitudinal patterns in the specialization of plant frugivore interactions, it has been observed that actually these interactions are more specialized at higher latitudes than at lower latitudes. And one of the reasons that has been suggested to be driving this pattern is that at higher latitudes, there are fewer plant species that frugivores can potentially interact with, such that it would favor these frugivores to become more specialist in their interactions. However, there are different factors that can still affect plant frugivore interactions, such as taxonomic, phylogenetic, and functional factors. And for example, we can have frugivores that they are more taxonomically specific in a way that they would only interact with a small fraction of available partners in a given site. And you can also have other species that are more taxonomically generalist, where they would interact with most of the available partners in a specific site. In a similar way, you can also have species that would interact mostly with phylogenetically related partners, maybe because of shared evolutionary history. So there, they would show this phylogenetic specificity in their interactions, whereas other species, they might be more generalist, phylogenetically speaking, with the partners that they are interacting with. And finally, there's also the functional aspect of these interactions, where some species, they can be more functionally specific, meaning that they will interact, for example, with plants that have similar fruit sizes, whereas other frugivores that can be more functionally generalist, where they can interact with partners that have fruits of variable sizes. So the goal of this project is that we wanted to see whether or not we can observe a latitudinal pattern in the taxonomic, phylogenetic, and functional specificity of plant frugivore interactions. And we also wanted to see whether or not similar trends would be observed considering different levels of organization. So we consider these patterns of interactions all the way from populations to species and communities. To answer these questions, we use a data set compiled by Frick and Svenning. And in this data set, there is information on plant and frugivore interactions for over 190 sites spread worldwide. And from this data set, we then obtained phylogenetic and functional information for over 1,000 bird species, where the functional information that we obtained was regarding beak size. And we also obtained phylogenetic information for over 1,000 plant species and functional information regarding seed mass for over 450 species. To assess whether the specificity of these interactions are different than what is expected by chance, we then generated null models for each site where a species was observed to occur and interact with other species. And in this model, if we obtain a negative value, that would mean that this species is interacting with partners that are more similar among themselves than what is expected by chance. And we are going to call this specificity. Values close to 0 would suggest that this species has no preference in the kinds of partners that they are interacting with. And we are going to call this aspecificity, whereas positive values would suggest that these species, they tend to interact mostly with partners that are very different from each other. And here we are going to call this anti-specificity. And to assess how these relationships varied across different levels of organizations, we consider different statistical models, but all these models, they had the same structure, where the specificity of these relationships is the response variable, and absolute latitude is the predictor in these models. So at the population level, we use linear mixed effect models, and then we consider species as a random factor. At the species level, we use phylogenetic generalized least squares to take into account the phylogenetic independence of species. And at the community level, we use ordinary least squares, since we didn't observe any sort of spatial signal in these specificity estimates. So here are our results for plants. In these plots, we have continuous gray lines and dashed gray lines. The continuous gray lines, they are suggesting relationships that were statistically significant, whereas the dashed gray lines, they are pointing to non-significant relationships. So on the top panel, we are looking at the taxonomic aspect of these interactions. And we can see that in general, plants, they tend to interact with a higher fraction of available partners at higher latitudes, suggesting that there is a trend for taxonomic anti-specificity in these interactions. However, something interesting is observed at the phylogenetic and functional level of these interactions. So the phylogenetic aspect is shown in the middle panel, whereas the functional level is shown at the bottom panel. And we can see that for both these panels, that they have these purple lines, and those purple lines, they are indicating the 95% confidence interval of the specificity that we estimated for each site. And the first thing we can notice is that most of those specificities, they are within this 95% confidence interval, suggesting that these species, they are not being more specific locally than what is expected by chance. When looking at the latitudinal trends in these interactions, we can see that at the phylogenetic level, the species, they don't show any sort of preference for their partners. And there is a trend for phylogenetic aspecificity in these interactions across different latitudes. At the functional level, in the bottom panels, we can see that there is a tendency for these plant species to become more specialized in their interactions at higher latitudes, meaning that they are tending to interact with more functionally similar bird species at higher latitudes. So they are showing a trend of functional specificity. However, all of these relationships, they were very, very weak, and a lot of the variation in the model remains unexplained. And when we look at the frugivores, we see a very similar pattern. So we see that they tend to become to interact with a higher fraction of available species, showing also a taxonomic anti-specificity in these relationships. Similarly, they don't show any sort of phylogenetic preference for their relationships across latitudes, so they are showing a phylogenetic aspecificity. And finally, at the functional level, they show that they tend to interact with plant species that are slightly more different at higher latitudes. So they are showing a trend for functional anti-specificity. However, these relationships, they were even weaker than the ones that we observed for plants. So in general, what we observed is that plant and frugivore interactions, they are often not different from what is expected under a null situation. And there are at least a couple of factors that could explain this result. For example, it has been shown that bird species that are introduced in new locations, they tend to interact with native plants regardless of having no shared evolutionary history. So they have this strong interaction with these native plants, and that could, for example, obscure any sort of phylogenetic specificity in these relationships. Similarly, if these birds, they are not experiencing any sort of morphological constraint in their interactions, meaning that they are able to swallow most of the fruits of the plant species that are coexisting with them, then there would also be no functional specificity in these relationships. Moreover, we also found that there is a general lack of latitudinal pattern in the specificity of these interactions. So this suggests that there are no latitudinal differences in the strength of phylogenetic and functional constraints that these species are experiencing. And finally, we observed that our results, they were consistent across the different levels of organizations that we consider, highlighting the general consistency of the lack of specificity in these relationships across different latitudes. Thank you.